Welcome. This breakout session is titled Confronting Minnesota Sex Offense Civil Commitment, Moving Away from Fear-Based Policies Toward Effective Community Violence Prevention. If you have any questions for our presenters, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. Also, if you have any technical difficulties, please email info@mnjrc.org or text 612-361-3951. I will put this information in the chat too. I would now like to turn it over to your presenters for today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Pete Dross, and I'm Vice President of External Relations at the Center for Victims of Torture.
And I'm Eric Janis. I am a retired law professor from Mitchell Hamlin College of School of Law, and I direct a center there right now called the Sex Offense Litigation and Policy Resource Center that provides support and advice and connections for lawyers around the country doing impact litigation in this area.
That's great. So I'm honored to be here with Eric, who is one of the nation's preeminent experts on the topic of sex offender civil commitment. I learn something every time I hear Eric speak on this issue, and you're going to learn a lot during his presentation, which will begin in a few minutes. But first, a few introductory remarks from me. At the Center for Victims of Torture, or CVT as we're known, our mission mandate includes torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. We rebuild the lives and restore the hope of survivors through therapeutic healing. We build the capacity of colleague torture survivor programs in the US and abroad, as well as other human rights organizations globally. We conduct research on effective approaches to healing survivors, and we engage in policy advocacy on international, national, and state levels. We're headquartered in the US, in Minnesota, and we work in the United States, Africa, and the Middle East. We're the largest organization of our kind in the world. One of the defining experiences of the survivors we work with is sexual violence. Virtually all of our clients, women, children, men, endured sexual abuse of some sort. And it's hard to argue that persons in the Minnesota Sex Offender Program, for reasons I'll discuss in just a moment, are not victims of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. So sexual violence and cruel treatment or punishment is what brings CVT to this issue. Now, in contrast to Eric, I'm a relative newcomer to the Minnesota Sex Offender Program. But the more I learn, the more horrifying it is. And here are a few of the things that I've learned in the 18 months or so since I began learning more about MSOP. There are now nearly 750 people confined in this program, most in Moose Lake, but also in St. Peter. It's functionally a system of indefinite detention. Some of the people have been imprisoned for more than 20 years. MSOP has had no discernible impact on the incidence of sexual violence in Minnesota. It costs Minnesota taxpayers more than $100 million annually, actually $112 million this year. One is nearly 6 times more likely to die in this so-called treatment program than be released from it. Let me say that again. One is almost 6 times more likely to die in this program than be released from it. People are committed to MSOP not for what they've done, because most of the residents have already served prison sentences, but rather because of someone's assessment of what they might do. And that is a chilling prospect. MSOP has been weaponized and used in political elections and campaigns by Republicans against Democrats and by Democrats against Republicans. Being soft on sex offenders makes for easy campaign fodder. A narrative has developed and taken hold that MSOP holds the worst of the worst. Is simply not true. Other untrue myths have taken hold, such as that they're all violent sexual predators who attack strangers. Yet 96% of sexual violence is committed by someone known to the victim. More than a third of the prisoners are over age 60, and the recidivism rate for persons that age is virtually non-existent. Because the population is on its face so unsympathetic, and because MSOP has been used as a weapon in elections to sunset the program and to reinvest in proven and promising approaches to ending sexual violence, and that is the goal of the group that Eric and I work with, we will need a bipartisan, right to left political coalition with victims advocates front and center. And we'll need to all look at each other, take a deep breath, link arms, and step off the curb together. And that is the coalition that we are trying to assemble. Now I'll turn it over to Eric for remarks on the science behind our efforts to end MSOP. Eric?
Thank you so much, Pete. And it's an honor to be on the program with you. And I've had a long admiration for your organization going back a number of decades. So I'm so pleased to be working together with you. And welcome everybody to this session. Just one preliminary remark. I've been working on this issue for a long time. And I want to disclose that at the beginning, in the early 90s, I was appointed by the court to represent one of the first people to be petitioned for commitment. So I don't come at this in a sense as entirely as a neutral scholar, but at least initially as a legal advocate. And I spent about 15 years challenging the constitutionality of the laws involved in this. But since then, I've been studying it and writing about it and trying to take an objective look at what the program is. So I'm going to share my screen here and get started. So we're talking about the sex offense civil commitment scheme, and in Minnesota, that's known for the program that implements that is called MSOP, Minnesota Sex Offender Program. Let's just start out by acknowledging that what this program is intended to do is address sexual violence. And we know that sexual violence is a widespread problem in our society. It ought to be a top priority for policymakers. And how we address it matters. And we ought to be asking at least two questions when we decide on our approach to sexual violence. Number one, is our approach effective? And we might be asking, does it prevent sexual violence or just punish? Does it support victims or just punish perpetrators? Is it evidence-based or is it fear-based? Second of all, we ought to be asking, is it just? Does it respect constitutional and human rights norms? And in a connected way, does it disproportionately impact BIPOC and sexual minorities? And one of the things I'll be suggesting, of course, is that it's neither constitutional nor respecting human rights, that it does disproportionately impact BIPOC people and sexual minorities, and that it's a poor model for addressing sexual violence. And let me just also emphasize that we welcome questions or comments. We'll be monitoring them. Please feel free to post your questions or comments as we go, and I'll be happy, and Pete and I will be happy to try to address them as we go along. So as we think about the Minnesota Sex Offender Program, Sex Offense Civil Commitment, we have to understand that it is the largest single investment in prevention of sexual violence in Minnesota. There are many other options for prevention, but this is by far the biggest investment. And we're investing $110 million per year in operating funds. That doesn't count the rather substantial capital investment that has been made to lock up about 750 people. And we need to emphasize that these are people who have already served their criminal sentences for doing sexual harm. And if you take a look at the facility where these people are kept, you might be hard-pressed to decide whether it's a prison or a treatment program. And this is a picture of the facility at Moose Lake. So what are the problems? Well, I mean, what could be wrong, in a sense, with locking up the so-called most dangerous people? Why is that a questionable policy? Well, number one, I want to suggest that it's an ineffective allocation of $110 million on prevention. And I'll explain why I think it's ineffective. Number two, it's the wrong model for sexual violence prevention. It focuses way, way, way downstream, way after the harm has been done. And in addition, it really emphasizes or valorizes a model that focuses on a discrete, despised minority. They are the ones responsible, and it absolves us of any responsibility for addressing the systemic societal values that allow sexual violence to flourish. And finally, MSOP and sex offender civil commitment embodies a dangerous principle. It's preventive confinement based on predicted future crimes of a reviled and degraded other. And I don't think I need to emphasize that unfortunately, the United States has a sad history of having such laws where there's a degraded group of others who are held to be not entitled to the same constitutional and other protections that we, the people, are entitled to. So first of all, what is civil commitment? Again, in Minnesota, it's embodied in the Minnesota Sex Offender Program, but it's really a whole set of laws and facilities and programs. So sex offense civil commitment, 20 jurisdictions in the US have a sex offense civil commitment law. 30 don't. Majority of states don't have it. In all of these states, it's post-sentence and post-prison confinement. These laws are based or modeled on a mental health civil commitment. Mental health civil commitment has a long history. It's in general addressed to people who have a severe mental illness that renders them unable to care for themselves. And perhaps because of that, they present a danger to themselves or a danger to others. It's modeled on that, but it's different. Instead of a severe mental illness, sex offense civil commitment requires showing of a mental abnormality. And as we've said, predicted future sexual harm. So these are based on some experts' prediction that in the future, somebody might commit a sexual crime. Again, civil commitment involves confinement in prison-like treatment centers, and this confinement is indefinite. Unlike a criminal sentence, which has an end date, civil commitment does not. And it is supposed to end when the risk ends, but as we'll show in Minnesota, that is the exception rather than the rule. In many states, these laws are referred to sexually violent predator laws. And of course, once they have that name, as you can imagine, it's very, very hard to curtail a program that is locking up so-called sexually violent predators. The process involves a petition for commitment, and the criteria are quite elastic. It requires showing of a mental abnormality and a high likelihood to engage in dangerous sexual behavior. Both of these are ill-defined, they're vague, and they result in a great deal of variability in terms of commitment. And let's see. We've got a question here. Are defendants required to be informed of the possibility of being referred to SOCC before they enter a guilty plea? Really good question. I think that I'm not sure if they're required to, and I'd welcome the advice of any criminal defense lawyers here, but they obviously ought to be, because it's a huge contingency that would ought to inform somebody's guilty plea. Under the Constitution, although civil commitment is indefinite, is supposed to end just as soon as the conditions that supposedly justify confinement no longer exist. And in particular, it should end when the individual no longer meets the threshold for dangerousness. And as we'll suggest, in Minnesota, that is the exception rather than the rule. We've got an elderly population, which by definition, as people grow older, their risk declines. So for any number of reasons, it's quite clear that among the 750 people who are confined, there are quite a number who do not meet the criteria for posing a very high risk. So the theory here, the reason this kind of thing was adopted, and the idea is that we're going to find the quote unquote most dangerous people, lock them up to keep them up from doing harm. And the question is what could be wrong with that idea? And that's what I hope to explore. The narrative at the beginning, and this was in the early 90s, is that this was going to be a real civil commitment program. 4 phases of 8 months each for model patients, and it was going to be a stopgap measure until criminal sentences for criminal sexual conduct could be lengthened. But that original purpose has been belied. The program was not temporary, and confinement has not been short. And as a matter of fact, since the original enactment of SOCC, MSOP in Minnesota, criminal sexual conduct sentences have more than doubled. So in a sense, in a true sense, we ought to be relying in part on the criminal justice system to hold people accountable. And that system has increased sentences, but nonetheless, we still have MSOP and sex offender civil commitment. So it wasn't a stopgap measure, and the number of commitments to MSOP has continued apace, and it's been quite variable. And in the mid-aughts, as you can see from this chart, there was a huge growth in the population of MSOP, arising from the Drew Shadeen murder tragedy and the political weaponization of MSOP that followed that. And we're still dealing with that. The annual sentence has grown, it's leveled off, but it's still a huge number of people who are confined. As Pete mentioned, the best way out historically of MSOP has been to die. We have 2 legal ways out: a provisional discharge into the community or a full discharge. A very small number of people have been fully discharged. A small number, but a trickle, have been provisionally discharged, but nearly 100 people have died in the program, and that remains to this day the most likely way that somebody's going to leave the program. Now, I mentioned that Minnesota is one of 20 states that has a SOCC program. And even among those 20 states, Minnesota is an outlier in a very significant way. And even if you're going to have SOCC, you don't have to do it like we do it here. Again, the majority of states don't have civil commitment. And as I'm going to suggest, there seems to be no discernible difference in the incidence of sexual violence among those states that do have versus those states that don't have SOCC. Minnesota is an outlier. The per capita commitments to MSOP in Minnesota are way at the top end nationally, well above even the closest state, which is Kansas. Minnesota is towards the bottom of states for people who've been discharged. You can see that in a number of states, there have been a lot of people who've been discharged, including our neighbor, Wisconsin. So Minnesota, there are models for doing this differently than we've been doing it. And in terms of conditional release, as a percent of committed individuals, again, Minnesota is towards the bottom. There are other states that have been doing it, moving people out of the program much more promptly, and without, and I will add, without adverse consequences. As I mentioned, civil commitment fluctuates with the political winds. The number of commitments per year has varied wildly from 16 or 17 to almost 100. And one must ask, if we're really committing the worst of the worst, which of these numbers represents that worst of the worst? Does it really represent danger, or is it really representing fear? And I think it's quite clear that it's fear that is motivating here. So I want to move on to talk about what the science has shown us that suggests that this is a poor, an ineffective way of addressing sexual violence. And I just want to make a quick distinction. We can think of the incidence of sexual violence, which is the number of new cases of criminal sexual conduct in a year. And when I say cases, I don't necessarily mean criminal cases, but how many instances of sexual abuse, sexual assault take place in a year. And in contrast to that is the recidivism rate. And when we are talking about civil commitment, we're mainly focusing on recidivism. So I just want to make sure that we understand that recidivism rate is the proportion of people who are arrested or convicted of a new sexual offense after having been previously convicted of a sexual offense. So these are, again, people who have been detected and convicted, sentenced perhaps, released from their sentence, and then commit another offense and are detected, arrested, or convicted for that. So we know that when we look at sexual offenses, there's a huge amount of attrition as the system, as these cases, if you will, go through the system. In Minnesota, we have about 12,000, it's estimated we have perhaps about 12,000 instances of sexual abuse each year. Only a fraction of those crimes are reported to the police. And reporting to police, to authorities, is very low, and it's among the lowest of all crimes of violence. There's further fall off in terms of arrest, in terms of closure by law enforcement, further fall off in terms of those who are convicted. And in fact, it's estimated that of all reported offenses, only about 10% end in conviction. Even a smaller percent go to prison. And then way at the end of the line, we have this notion of recidivism. The idea that having gone through this whole system, person is released from their criminal sentence and is detected and arrested and convicted again. So with that introduction, let's take a look at what the science tells us. And one key question we want to ask is, does civil commitment affect the incidence of sexual violence or the rate of recidivism? Two separate things. So a key study published about 10 years ago in the Brooklyn Law Review by two very prominent scholars attempted to ask and answer this first question. Does the passage of SOCC law make a difference in the incidence or rate of sexual violence in a particular state? And their method was to compare states with SOCC laws to those without. And they did a before and after study. They looked at the rate of abuse before passage of the law and compared it to the rate of abuse after passage of the law. So if you take a look at the mean rate of, we're talking about child abuse, child sexual abuse here, you will see that the SOCC states had a lower rate of child sexual abuse than non-SOCC states. And that was true both before and after passage. But the key here is, what effect did the passage of these laws have on that rate? And what these researchers found is that in both cases, the rate declined, and the decline in the rate of child sexual abuse was greater, not by very, very much, but greater in the non-SVP states compared to the SVP states. So, and here's a graphic representation of the rate of forcible rape in contrast to child sexual abuse, showing that basically the same thing, that there was a decline in both sets of states, and the decline more or less parallels. So these researchers concluded that the passage of SOCC laws has had no discernible deterrent or incapacitation effect on either the rate of forcible rape or on the rate of child sexual abuse. And they make the logical next step, which is that if these laws have no discernible effect on the rate, then wouldn't it be more effective to reallocate these 110 million that we're spending on other more effective methods of addressing sexual violence? So that study asked, what about the effect on the incidence of sexual violence? The second study, done by Grant Dewey here in Minnesota, asked, does civil commitment reduce sexual recidivism? His methodology was to take a look at at a group of people. Here, let me just go back a second here. Yeah. Okay, sorry. His methodology was to take a look at a group of people who were of sex offenders who were released from prison and not committed, and ask what the recidivism rate for that group was. And he found that the recidivism rate over 4 years, looking at reconviction, was about 3% for the group of offenders who were released from prison and not committed. Then he looked at the group of people during the same time who were actually committed to MSOP. And now those people, of course, were locked up, so they didn't have the opportunity to commit a recidivistic crime. But he used a risk assessment tool called the MSOP. It's a tool that estimates the risk of reoffense, and it's used when people are being petitioned for civil commitment. And using that tool, he estimated that the risk of reoffense over 4 years of those who were committed was 9.2%. So the committed people had about a 3 times higher risk of recidivism than the non-committed people. But in both cases, the risk of recidivism was quite relatively small. So one thing we can understand from that is that the estimated recidivists among committed individuals is a minority. Most individuals who are committed would not be recidivists. But we might ask then, well, what about the effect of recidivism in the community of civil commitment? Well, every year there are about 1,200 sex offenders who are released from confinement. And if you apply Dewey's 2.8% recidivist figure to that, we would expect there to be 33 or 34 recidivists among those 1,200 people who are being released. About 15 or 20 of those who are released are actually not released, they're committed. So let's assume 20 and a 9.2% recidivism rate. So we're committing about 2 recidivists. So what that means is that here's the recidivist, this circle represents the recidivists in the community without MSOP. This graph shows the recidivists in the community with MSOP. In other words, MSOP reduces recidivism, but by a very small amount. Most recidivists are still going to be released in the community. So if we say, look, MSOP confines 740 or 750 sex offenders, how can it be that it doesn't make much of a difference in the rate of sexual violence in the community? Well, the answer is because MSOP focuses on a small sliver of a small sliver of the problem of sexual violence. Recidivism is not the main problem. There's a lot of statistics that back this up, but let me just show one. Most people who are convicted of a sex offense are first-time offenders. In other words, they have not been convicted of a sex offense before. 7% of convictions of a sex offense are recidivists. 93% are not recidivists when they are convicted. So if you want to try to focus on reducing criminal sexual conduct and you're only focusing on recidivism, you're only looking at a very small part of the problem. Same thing for sex offense arrests. Only about 5% of those who are arrested for a sex offense are are recidivists. 95% are first-time offenders. So since MSOP reduces recidivists by a very small amount, what we're basically saying is that MSOP is addressing a sliver of a sliver. Recidivism is a very small part of the problem of sexual violence, and MSOP reduces recidivism only by a small sliver. And that explains why we don't see any kind of statistically noticeable effect on the incidence of recidivism or sexual violence in the community. So the question we ought to be asking is this very small part, a small sliver, a small part of the problem, worth 110 million every year? Now, MSOP has been repeatedly studied and with many different angles, suggesting a need for reform. Very comprehensive study done in 2011 by the Office for a Legislative Auditor. They found, as we've suggested, that there are clients, even back then, who due to age or disability could be likely managed in alternative settings. Most other states allow offenders to be released from commitment when they no longer meet commitment criteria. Minnesota doesn't do that. There was a study in 2013 by a task force that contained a cross-section of law enforcement, prosecutors, treatment people, defense lawyers, academics. They too said there's broad consensus that the current system captures too many people and keeps them too long. The task force says that it was unanimous in the conclusion that there are serious problems and that legislative action is required. The task force issued a set of recommendations. Those recommendations were introduced into legislation, but the legislation did not pass, again, because of the weaponization of this issue. And so, again, repeatedly, we've gone without reform. There was a class action, again, in the federal court that made a number of findings, and they followed the same pattern. that there's not a system in MSOP for identifying people who could be released without risk to the community and then facilitating that reentry. So question, what does this amount to? Well, it's a clear violation of rights of the individuals who are confined, but it's also a misallocation of precious prevention dollars. Just to take a few examples, how does 110 million a year compare to the resources available to other organizations that are working to prevent sexual violence or support victims? Violence Free Minnesota, a budget of 1.5 million per year. Minnesota Department of Health, grants for prevention, 600,000 a year. The Violence Against Women Act programs in Minnesota, 1.3 million. Drop in the bucket compared to the 110 million that we spend to lock people up. It's also clear that our law enforcement are underfunded in terms of their ability to close cases and hold people accountable. And we know that there are many other approaches to prevention that if we really want to reduce the incidence of sexual violence, we'd be working on a comprehensive, evidence-based set of approaches, including primary prevention, which are programs designed to stop harm before it takes place. There are a number of very well-studied approaches, but we need more of them that have been proven to reduce the incidence of sexual assault materially. We need institutional reform. The Me Too movement has shown us that. We need improved law enforcement. We need to be removing barriers and disincentives to reporting sexual violence. And we need to be improving re-entry of people who've done into the community of people who've done sexual harm. Many, many people suggest a public health approach. And again, this would be a comprehensive and systematic approach with primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions. We would be looking for root causes and looking to address root causes. It would be evidence-based. We'd be assessing what works and replicating best practices. But instead, what we're doing is spending a huge amount of money locking up a few people. So I think it's clear that we could be using the 110 million in other ways that would be more effective at prevention. But I want to move on from there because I want to suggest that this idea of locking people up in advance of some predicted harm is a really dangerous idea because it's based on the idea that there's a group of what could be referred to as degraded others that inhabit an alternate and diminished system of legal rights. And unfortunately, in the US, we have a sad history of that. And sex offense civil commitment follows directly in the footsteps of the eugenics movement that resulted in laws allowing the forced sterilization of so-called mentally deficient individuals, approved in the infamous Buck versus Bell case. This case was cited originally in the litigation supporting sex offense civil commitment, and the sex offense civil commitment embodies the same principles. Internment of Japanese American citizens during World War II based on the same principle of preventive detention. Jim Crow laws, legal apartheid in the US, same idea, a degraded other that aren't entitled to the same rights as, quote unquote, we the people. And in fact, the Minnesota program has been subject to litigation in Great Britain, in particular in conjunction with Minnesota's attempt to extradite a convicted child molester, Sean Sullivan. His extradition was contested in Britain, and the court in Britain refused to extradite him precisely because it found that Minnesota's program was a flagrant denial of the rights enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights. We also know that MSOP extends and aggravates the disproportionate carceral impact on BIPOC individuals. Here, this chart shows for Black and American Indian individuals, the proportion in orange of those individuals in the program in MSOP compared to the proportion in the community. And you can see that it's, as it is in the carceral system, vastly disproportionate. In addition, SOCC laws are a poor foundation for sexual violence policy. Well, what do I mean by that? These laws are based on the idea that rapists are psychologically abnormal, that sexual violence is beyond the control of the perpetrator, and that the problem is them and not us. So the whole idea of this SOCC, sex offense civil commitment, is that there needs to be some psychological abnormality shown. Whereas we know that most sexual violence comes not out of a sexual or a psychological abnormality, but because of societal values that allow and tolerate sexual violence. I mean, certainly there are some people who perpetrate sexual violence who do have psychological abnormalities, but that to say that to characterize sexual violence as being typically based on that misrepresents the nature of sexual violence. In addition, to say that sexual violence is beyond the control of the perpetrator, which is exactly what civil commitment is based on, is also contrary to what we know, which is that sexual violence is fully under the control of people who perpetrate it, and they need to be held accountable for what they do. Both of these then suggest that the problem is a small, discrete group of people. If only we could find them, we'll lock them up, send them away, and that takes care of the problem. We don't have to do anything else to deal with the problem. So why should we care about this? Well, 110 million is at stake. Prevention is at stake. Victim support is at stake. It's not a sound foundation for prevention. It misrepresents the nature of sexual violence and distorts our approach to it. If we make the wrong choices in programming, not only will we be violating some people's rights, but we'll be allowing additional victimizations. And the politics has made discussion of this almost impossible. Why do these laws persist? Well, because they are easy to demagogue and they're easy to suggest that we're locking up sexually violent people and taking care of the problem. And we ought to be making our policy in Minnesota based on a much better approach. We should not be engaging in gotcha politics. We should be talking about these things based on evidence and based on effectiveness. So what do we propose? A collaborative problem-solving effort. People who care about prevention ought to be getting together with people who care about accountability, survivor support, re-entry, human rights, and we ought to be having a deep conversation, getting away from gotcha politics. So let me end there. I want to refer people to a couple of resources. There's a really good documentary called Untouchable. It's available online for streaming. I suggest that take a look at it. If you're interested in delving deeper into at least my thinking about this, my book published a while ago by Cornell University Press explores what the problems of these sexual predator laws are. So let me end there and let's entertain any questions that there are. Pete, do you want to add anything, or let's see? Yeah.
Well, let's see. We don't have any questions in the Q&A yet. But so Eric, what this is going to require a political solution. I mean, so if you could propose a solution to this problem that you've laid out, what would it be? Would there still be an MSOP?
You know, I think that in my view, we could approach this in two ways. My preference would be to sunset the program, to stop commitments and to, in an orderly way, reintegrate the 750 folks who have been locked up there, as you point out, many for decades, give them the support they need for safe reentry into the community. That would require legislative, a legislative solution. And it's possible that we could put together a coalition of victim advocates, human rights advocates that would, and treatment people that would convince the legislature that what our current choices actually are not saving the most people from violence. There's a second approach, and that is to try to reform MSOP, move as many people as possible out back into the community. But I also know that as long as MSOP is there, it will be used. And we'll go through cycles of moral panic where, politicians will turn to it. And so the safest thing for our community, I think, is to sunset it. So I guess we have a comment here. You have laid out a compelling logical argument, but the politics seems to be driven by emotional reactions. How do we craft an effective message in that arena? Absolutely. And I think that, in our experience, there are a wide range of people who think that the current approach is broken. And they include people who are clearly anti-violence advocates, victim advocates. And I think that one thing we need to make room for is for a range of people to express their views about and then we change the question that's being framed. Currently, the framing of the question is, who are the most dangerous and how do we lock them up? We ought to change the frame to, how can we prevent the most danger?
If I could just add to that, Eric, before we move on to the next question. So as I said before, I'm a kind of a newcomer to this issue. And one of the things that I have found is that when you talk to people who are knowledgeable about MSOP, policymakers, people who are both in the health and human services sector as well as in the corrections sector, you talk about MSOP and the reaction is pretty much the same. People look down, they look to the side, they take a deep breath, and they say something like, yeah, that's really messed up. So I think that the challenge is to create a compelling, logical alternative to MSOP and to create that bipartisan coalition that gets together behind a political solution to it. So.
And let me just mention on that, well, I haven't mentioned that it's interesting because this is not kind of a liberal conservative the normal liberal conservative spectrum. There are many progressive Democrats that were behind the passage of this law. Their motivation actually was, preventing sexual violence. Good motivation. It's just gotten out of hand, and it was the wrong idea. As well, there are a number of politically conservative people who are very worried about government overreach, and this if there ever was government overreach, this is it.
Yeah.
So we have a comment here. Let me just read it. How do you envision the best way to turn towards the deep discomfort that requires turning towards the way that we socialize boys and men, e.g. a culture that enables sexual violence via norms of traditional masculinity? I totally agree. We are much more comfortable in the same way that we think about racism in policing, for example. It's those bad guys over there with the problem, rather than looking at and genuinely transforming white supremacy. So what do we do to get communities to care about socializing boys and men in a different way, which we are all responsible for? I agree. I think that totally hits the nail on the head. It's socializing boys and men. It's looking at our institutions, you know, all the way from the Boy Scouts to various religious institutions to athletic organizations, where we've seen continual exposés of policies and practices that tolerate sexual abuse by generally powerful white men of more vulnerable people. So those are the issues that everybody needs to confront. And I just think that we need to work on changing the narrative. And it's uncomfortable because it suggests, again, that there's something flawed in our society, and we know what the pushback to that can be. I don't know the answer, other than to have a coalition of people who say, look, this is too important an issue to play gotcha politics. Let's really think about how we can, in an evidence-based way, make changes that reduce sexual violence.
Well, and also, I mean, just imagine if even a fraction of the $110, $112 million could be allocated toward preventing sexual violence, the conversations that could be had in schools and in faith communities, in institutions like the Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, as you mentioned, Eric. We're by investing in so much money in MSOP, we are starving investments in programs that can really be effective at preventing violence. Yeah.
Right. Let's see, we have a question. What level of communication with family and community are people on the inside allowed? You know, I know it's limited, it's controlled, it's monitored. You know, there's certainly family members can visit and communicate, but I think the nature of the communication is pretty limited. I don't know the details, unfortunately. And I also know that there are that the institution, MSOP, has a number of rules about what kind of communications are allowed, and they can be quite controlling in terms of communications that are critical of the program and that they view as counter-therapeutic. So I would say by no means is there free and open communication allowed, but that doesn't mean that there's none.
Yeah, I speak by phone with one of the residents at MSOP Moose Lake on either a weekly or bi-weekly basis. He's allowed to call me, but I pay for those calls. So they're charged for those calls. You might also note that KBJR television in Duluth, Minnesota, recently did a three-part investigative series on MSOP, and the reporter there was allowed in to interview a number of the residents. But I would recommend interested people here on this in this presentation to check out that KBJR report. 3 segments. They ran about 2 weeks ago. Each segment is 7 to 8 minutes long, so it'll give you a different an additional perspective on the issue.
And let me mention one more thing, and that is that my organization, the Sex Offense Litigation and Policy Resource Center, we're working on a comprehensive report about MSOP in conjunction with the group that Pete and I have been working with. And I expect that that is going to be released sometime after the new year. That'll kind of cover a lot of the ground that we covered here today in a written form. And then we'll be aiming for a conference later in the spring to bring together people who are interested in this. So you might want to kind of keep an eye out for both of those if you have an interest in working on this. So it looks like we're close to the end, but if there's anybody else who has a comment or a question, we'd love to hear from you. Well, hearing none, thank you all for sticking it out with us, and feel free to get in touch with either of us if you want some more information or want to be involved.
And don't hesitate to talk to your legislators about MSOP and sex offender civil commitment and what you learned today, especially from Eric Janis, one of the nation's true experts on this issue.
Thank you. All right. Ciao.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.